Good evening. I want to welcome you to Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center's Lakin Lecture series on anti-Semitism. I am Lori Shepard, Executive Director, and on behalf of myself, our Board of Directors, our staff, and our volunteers of Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center, we want to thank you all for being here with us tonight. Some of you, we appreciate that you braved some cooler temperatures and even a few snow flurries to be here in person. And also, we want to thank those who are participating with us online. We are a little jealous that you're cozy and warm. As you all know, this series is made possible by a gift from the Alma and Ed Lakin Education Fund. This fund was established at Jewish Community Foundation of Southern Arizona by their daughter to honor her parents' lifelong commitment to Holocaust education, the people of Israel, to Jewish life, and to combating anti-Semitism. Each step of the way, as we've designed this lecture series, our team has sought to ensure that everything that we do honors Alma and Ed Lakin's legacy of advocacy and social justice. Tonight, as we come together for the fourth in this very important series, we are so pleased to take a look back on the goals that we set for ourselves, the programming ideas that we had, and to see all that we have achieved. We kicked off the Lakin Lecture series here with Arno Rosenfeld, as he talked with us about combating anti-Semitism, what is contemporary anti-Semitism, and what does it mean? And then we moved on to a wonderful local panel of leaders who talked to us about what does anti-Semitism look like here in Southern Arizona. And then in November, we were back here again welcoming Ben Friedman as we explored Jewish pride and how Jews and Jewish allies can use that movement to fight hatred. We have learned so much from these presentations. And we also learned a lot from our participants. Our participants gave us tremendous feedback. And one of the most important revelations that we have had was that while our participants are so grateful for all that our speakers, our panelists have brought to them, they also wanted a little bit more, particularly in the difficult weeks and now months that have followed since October 7th. We have watched and listened, and we recognize that on the whole, people have a strong desire. They have a need to feel heard, to be seen, themselves as individuals in this Jewish community. So we did what we do. We changed things up. And tonight, we've created a space where all participants can feel listened to, valued, and heard. We created a place where a person can ask a question, offer their own commentary, or just share how they're feeling. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our amazing speaker for the evening, Professor Dov Waxman, and he's going to share a program that we have had in the works since last summer. And immediately after Professor Waxman's presentation, we will go into the World Cafe conversation portion of our event, both in person and for those of you online. Our fabulous table facilitators will help guide us through what we hope will be the first of many powerful and personal conversations. Afterwards, we're going to come back together and offer some final thoughts, comments, and questions. So, without further ado, Dov Waxman is the director of the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel. I already messed it up. He is the director of the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. He is a professor of political science and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israeli Studies at UCLA. He is an award-winning teacher. He previously was professor of political science, international affairs, and Israel studies, and the Stotsky Professor of Jewish Historical and Cultural Studies at Northeastern University. He also co-directed the university's Middle Eastern Center. In addition, he has taught classes at the University of New York and Bowdoin College. He has been a visiting fellow at Tel Aviv University, at Bar Ilan University, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Oxford University. Professor Waxman received his PhD and his Master's of Arts from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and he received his BA degree from Oxford University. Professor Waxman's research focuses on the conflict over Israel-Palestine, Israeli politics and foreign policy, U.S.-Israel relations, American Jewry's relationship with Israel, Jewish politics, and anti-Semitism. He clearly wanted to take on the easy stuff. He is the author of dozens of scholarly articles and of 4 fabulous books: The Pursuit of Peace and the Crisis of Israeli Identity, Defining the Nation, Israel's Palestinians, the Conflict Within, Trouble in the Tribe, the American Jewish Conflict over Israel, and the one that has been with me nonstop for the last 3 months, the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, What Everyone Needs to Know. He has also been published in the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, The Guardian, The Atlantic Monthly, Salon, Foreign Policy, The Forward, Haaretz, and he is a frequent commentator on television and radio programs. As one might imagine, Professor Waxman's expertise has been in high demand recently, and we are thankful for this opportunity to bring him here to talk with us in Southern Arizona. Please help me welcome Professor Dov Waxman.
Hello, everybody. I want to first of all thank Laurie for inviting me, for being such a wonderful host. And also I want to commend her for putting together a really outstanding series of lectures. And I'm honored to be here to give the final one in this series. I'm very happy to see so many of you here this evening, but I wish in some ways there was less of you, because it would suggest that this topic wasn't quite so relevant. Sadly, this is a subject that has become so topical in recent months. Today, of course, marks the 3rd month anniversary, 3 months since October the 7th. A date that I think is seared into all of our consciousness, a date that we will never forget. We should never forget what happened on that day. 1,200 Israelis brutally murdered, over 140 taken hostage, many of whom still held in captivity in Gaza as I speak. And clearly we're all still reeling from the shock and the horror of what took place on the 7th of October. And it will be a day, I think, that will be long remembered in Israel and across the Jewish world as the darkest day in Israel's history, and in many ways, the darkest day in Jewish history since the end of World War II. We've also observed over the last few months, as the war in Gaza has escalated, we've also observed a surge of protests, of demonstrations around the world. Just yesterday, as I was making my way here from Los Angeles, on the way to the airport, there was a big demonstration on the 405 freeway, which disrupted all of the traffic. It was a big demonstration of protests against the war. These demonstrations have become extremely common around the world, across the United States, and obviously we've seen them happening on many college campuses as well, including my own college campus. And while these demonstrations have been taking place, there's also been attacks, assaults against Jews around the world, including in the United States, in Los Angeles, where I live, the home of a Jewish family was broken into by somebody shouting "Free Palestine," who tried to attack their family members. Thankfully, they were apprehended. A Jewish deli in a Jewish area of Los Angeles was graffitied, defaced, with graffiti about Gaza. There have been many incidents like this, not only in Los Angeles, but in many, many cities and towns across the United States and around the world. Jewish schools have been shot at. Synagogues have been firebombed. People have been harassed and assaulted in the streets. What we've seen in this surge of anti-Semitic incidents taking place around the world isn't entirely unprecedented. In previous escalations of violence between Israel and the Palestinians, there's also been escalations or surges of anti-Semitic incidents. And this has been particularly the case in Europe, where I'm originally from, for many years now, going back to the Second Intifada. It is a newer development to see this happening in the United States, and one that I think has been profoundly shocking to many Jewish Americans. And it's, of course, happening in the context of an already growing number of anti-Semitic incidents taking place in the United States. Anti-Semitism didn't suddenly become a problem on October the 8th and in the last few months. Anti-Semitism has been a growing problem in the United States for a few years now. We've seen rising anti-Semitism. But what we've seen over the last few months is the intersection of anti-Semitism and opposition to Israel and protests against Israel. Not the kind of far-right or white nationalist attacks like that took place most devastatingly in Pittsburgh in 2018. Rather, these are attacks against Jews and Jewish institutions that have been coming not from white nationalists or far-right extremists in most cases, but rather from people who might identify as being on the left. And so we see this kind of convergence, this anti-Semitism coming on both the left and the right, and I think it is a moment in many ways, maybe even an unprecedented moment for Jewish Americans, feeling this wave of anti-Semitism and a great sense of fear. And what it's done is really intensify a debate that was already happening over the last few years, a debate about anti-Zionism and its relationship to anti-Semitism. This is not by any means a new debate. This is a debate actually that has gone on for decades. Certainly in academic and scholarly circles, there's been this debate for a very long time. And in recent years, there's been a growing debate about the relationship between the two, whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, whether we should identify anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic, and maybe what follows from that. But this debate has really intensified and become not just a debate that's happening within the Jewish community, but in many ways a national debate that is happening over the last few months. In fact, it is probably one of the biggest debates of our time. And we've seen this, we've heard this debate now taking place in Congress, we've seen it in the media, and I don't think it's likely to die down anytime soon. And the reason this debate is growing and becoming increasingly intense is because anti-Zionism itself is having a revival. Anti-Zionism is having something of a renaissance. It's becoming more popular and more audible, more visible, more audible. We're more aware of it than we were in years past. And it's making a comeback, specifically on the American left, but also among many left-wing Jews themselves. You can think about organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, which explicitly identifies itself as an anti-Zionist organization, and also an organization like If Not Now, which is not explicitly anti-Zionist, but is increasingly a home for young Jewish anti-Zionists. On college campuses, we see anti-Zionism becoming increasingly part of the discourse on campus, on protests on campus, as young people have really embraced, or increasingly embracing, the Palestinian cause. And I'm sure you've heard of the surveys that are showing how much young Americans, those under the age of 35, are increasingly much more sympathetic to the Palestinians than to Israel, but also increasingly critical of Zionism itself. I think part of what's fueling this revival or renaissance for anti-Zionism is the perception, the belief that is widely shared, that the two-state solution, the possibility of creating a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel, that solution, which has been, of course, the kind of diplomatic holy grail for decades now, more and more people believe that is no longer possible, that the window of opportunity for reaching a two-state solution has closed. And so as a result, you see growing interest and discussion about other kinds of solutions, such as a so-called one-state solution or a binational solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that's one, and that in turn is raising a discussion not about what Israel should do vis-a-vis the Palestinians, which has long been the debate, a debate that generally pitted pro-Israel hawks against pro-Israel doves. Instead, the debate is increasingly becoming not about what Israel should do, but what Israel should be, what kind of a country it should be, what kind of a state it should be. And that, in turn, opens up a discussion about Zionism itself. Alongside that, we're hearing much more in the media from Palestinians themselves. And so I think more and more Americans are being exposed to Palestinian perspectives and the Palestinian narrative in a way that they weren't in decades past. And as I will soon discuss, Palestinians are obviously presenting a very different view of Zionism than one that most Americans have heard in the past. And so anti-Zionism then is increasingly entering into our public conversation. And I don't think that's likely to change, whether we like it or not. It is a part of the public conversation in the United States now, as it has been in Western European countries for some time. And as a result, the question of whether or not anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic is gaining new urgency and becoming increasingly important. Now, I don't want to exaggerate or overstate the extent to which anti-Zionism is gaining support in the United States. It's important to recognize that it's still fairly marginal. You might not get that impression if you spend a lot of time on Twitter or if you read certain websites, but in fact, it's still a very marginal phenomenon in terms of popularity. A survey that was taken in June of last year, of a representative survey of American adults, showed that only a minority of those surveyed had any opinion whatsoever about Zionism. Just 12% of those surveys said they had a negative opinion about Zionism. Right? So that would be kind of the anti-Zionist perspective. But only 8% said they had a positive opinion of Zionism. So we see that most people, most Americans, 2/3 of those in that survey, had no opinion about it. So it's not something that is as widespread as we sometimes think. It is often more among intellectuals, academics, college students, journalists. Nevertheless, it is, I think, a growing phenomenon. And as a result, there is this growing debate. And I think I want to kind of characterize the two sides in this debate. On the one hand, we have those who argue that essentially anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism, right? We can call that position the conflators, right? They equate the two. Say, one, this is anti-Semitism. On the other side of the debate, I'll call them the deniers, there are those who deny that there's any linkage between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. They're two completely separate things. In the Jewish world, we have an organization like the ADL, publicly stating that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. On the other side of the spectrum, JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, insisting that anti-Zionism is never anti-Semitic, okay? They argue that Zionism is an ideology, right? And therefore opposing Israel is completely different than hating Jews, and we should not confuse the two. This is the debate as it's playing out now between these two sides, broadly speaking, the conflators on the one hand and the deniers on the other hand. I think this debate is very problematic. I think it's very polarized, and it's very problematic between these two diametrically opposed positions. And there's a couple of fundamental problems with this debate, as I see it. First of all, both sides in the debate tends to rely on very different understandings of what they mean by Zionism and anti-Zionism, right? So they talk about Zionism and anti-Zionism, but very rarely, if ever, do they actually define what they mean by these terms. And as a result of that, it's quite often that they're just talking past each other. They're just not really engaging with each other because they actually have very different understandings, things in mind, of what Zionism means and of what anti-Zionism means. And I think that's one problem. Now, that may be a typical academic complaint, right? We need to define our terms. But I think understanding how we use these terms, right, what we mean by them is very important. The second problem, and the one that I want to really address this evening, is the way in which this debate is framed in either-or terms. In other words, either anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic or it isn't anti-Semitic, right? That is the way the debate is framed. This presents, I think, a false binary, a false choice. In other words, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic is the wrong question to ask. I think a better question, the one that I want to address this evening, is when is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? When does anti-Zionism turn into anti-Semitism? That's the question we need to address. In other words, rather than take one of these very polarized positions and insist that anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitic or anti-Zionism is never anti-Semitic, I think we have to take a more nuanced approach. We have to take an approach that understands that sometimes anti-Zionism, maybe often anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, and sometimes it isn't. That there can be an anti-Semitic anti-Zionism and a non-anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. And so that's what I want to try to chart this evening, to try to look at when can it be anti-Semitic and when might it not be anti-Semitic. Now, to do that, to really understand this relationship in more than these very simple slogans, right, we first need to understand something more basic. That is, what anti-Semitism is, right? We can't talk about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic without having an understanding of what makes anything anti-Semitic. And very often, unfortunately, people don't do this. People use the term anti-Semitic very often to simply mean something that they don't like or they oppose. Right now, we need to use the term anti-Semitism. We need to have a very specific and clear understanding of what anti-Semitism is and how it manifests. And unfortunately, we tend not to have such an understanding. Many people just think of it in very simplistic terms as hating Jews, right? Well, anti-Semitism does involve hatred of Jews, but it's not just about hating Jews. So I want to briefly elaborate on how I think anti-Semitism manifests, the different ways in which it operates, and then we can see how to apply this to anti-Semitism. And hopefully in doing so, I can give you kind of tools or a framework to then identify when is it anti-Semitic and when isn't it anti-Semitic. So the most obvious way we can think about how anti-Semitism manifests is in a person's attitudes. In other words, what they think about Jewish people, right? How they feel towards Jews. And so, you know, in that sense, hating Jews is obviously one manifestation of anti-Semitism. But it's not just about hatred. There may be a whole range of emotions that a person might have towards Jews. They might be jealous, they might be resentful, they might be suspicious. These are all anti-Semitic emotions, right? These are all anti-Semitic attitudes that a person might have. A person might not have any negative emotions towards Jews, and instead they might have negative beliefs about Jews, right? They might believe Jews are clannish, that they are miserly, whatever these kinds of anti-Semitic ideas are, all of that we can think of as like negative beliefs and emotions that somebody might have towards Jews, how they feel about Jews. But that's not just what anti-Semitism consists of. Anti-Semitism is not just what person thinks or feels about Jews, it's also how people behave towards Jews. In other words, it's not just an attitude, it's also behavior. And behavior not just of individuals, but of groups of people, of institutions, even of governments, right? So when we think about anti-Semitic behavior, we're talking about how people treat Jews and how they behave towards them, or how organizations do that. And there's a whole range of what we might call behavioral anti-Semitism. Insults, for example, assaults, harassment, vandalism, violence, discrimination, persecution, oppression, I can go on, right? All of this is alongside prejudice. Prejudice in terms of attitudes, but also discrimination in terms of behavior, right? And sometimes the two don't necessarily go together. There can be discrimination without prejudice. There can be prejudice without discrimination. In other words, a person might dislike Jews, but not behave differently toward them, because they might feel that, for example, that behavior wouldn't be socially acceptable, right? The third way in which anti-Semitism manifests, alongside attitudes and in behavior, is in what we, in broadly speaking, kind of cultural ideas and stereotypes and tropes. Okay, in other words, how Jews are depicted, right, in our culture. What ideas, what are the collective ideas or beliefs that exist? So we can think about anti-Semitic stereotypes. I already mentioned a few of them, Jews being greedy, for example, or clannish. We can think about anti-Semitic tropes, like Jews controlling the media, or banks, or governments, or plotting to take over the world. And we can also think about anti-Semitic myths, right? Some of these anti-Semitic myths are very, very old, the oldest being the myth of deicide, the myth that Jews killed Jesus, right? Another very old, not quite as old anti-Semitic myth, one that dates back to the 11th century, is the blood libel, right? That Jews use the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes. That's an anti-Semitic myth that has been deeply embedded in Western culture over many centuries. So when we think about what's anti-Semitic, it's not just about what a person thinks, right, or feels towards Jews. It's also about behavior, actions towards Jews, and it's also about how Jews are being depicted or represented. All of these, then, are ways in which something can be anti-Semitic. Okay, so I want you to have that framework in mind, and now let's apply that to the question of anti-Zionism, right? And so when we think about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, I want to suggest that we use the same criteria to decide about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic that we would to decide about whether anything is anti-Semitic. So we're consistent. So we can apply the same approach, and we can explain to people clearly, and people often need this to be explained, right, what makes something anti-Semitic or not. Often people, especially non-Jewish people, aren't aware of this, right? They don't know what makes something anti-Semitic or not, and we need to be able to explain that to them. So the first thing we should ask, right, is it motivated by an anti-Semitic attitude? What's the attitude behind it? Is it driven by hostility towards Jews, feelings of hostility or prejudice against Jews? The second question we should ask, does it involve discrimination against Jews? Does it involve anti-Jewish behavior or actions, right? And third, does it depict Zionists or Israel in terms of anti-Semitic stereotypes? So anti-Semitic tropes or stereotypes or myths being invoked, whether intentionally or not. And very often people can draw on anti-Semitic stereotypes, tropes, and myths inadvertently, unwittingly. Right? The reason for that is these are deeply embedded in our culture. It's not just hardcore anti-Semites, right? The small number of people who really, really hate Jews who believe anti-Semitic tropes or stereotypes. Many, many other people might also believe certain ideas about Jews because they've been circulating in our culture, in Western culture at least, for many centuries. Okay, so with those three questions in mind, let's now try to address the question of whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. So the first question then is it motivated by anti-Semitism, right? Is it motivated by hostility towards Jews? Those who argue that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic often argue that anti-Zionists are secretly motivated by anti-Semitic feelings and beliefs. So the claim here is that anti-Zionism is merely a cover, right, a disguise or a mask, because it's more socially acceptable. People don't feel that they can express anti-Semitism, so instead they express their anti-Zionism. Alan Dershowitz put it in this manner: it calls itself anti-Zionism, but it is only a cover for anti-Jewish bigotry. So what this is doing essentially is attributing a single motive, a singular motive, a malign motive to all anti-Zionists, that's really what's driving them. Now, I think clearly in the case of some anti-Zionists, that is no doubt the truth. I can think of somebody like David Duke or Louis Farrakhan, right? Prominent anti-Zionists, who are also rabid anti-Semites, right? So there's no question that for some people, anti-Zionism is a way of expressing opposition or hatred towards Jews in a more socially acceptable manner, right? No doubt about it that some anti-Zionists have this motivation. But would it be correct to claim that all anti-Zionists have this secret motivation? Well, I want to read to you a quote by the late historian Bernard Lewis, who is not somebody we think of as an anti-Zionist, but Bernard Lewis said, quote, "It would be palpably unjust, even absurd, to assert that all critics or opponents of Zionism or Israel are moved by anti-Semitism." He also noted it would be equally mistaken to deny that anti-Zionism can on occasion provide a cloak of respectability for a prejudice which, at the present time and in the free world, is not normally admitted in public by anyone with political ambitions or cultural pretensions. In other words, what Bernard Lewis is saying is, yes, sometimes some people are secretly motivated by anti-Semitism, but we certainly wouldn't say that everybody who's critical of Zionism has such a motive. So again, sometimes, but not always. Let me now turn to more specific examples. Let's think, first of all, about Jews who are anti-Zionist. There's a long tradition, a long history of Jewish anti-Zionism. Jewish anti-Zionism dates back to the emergence of Zionism itself in the late 19th century, right? It's basically emerged almost at the same time as Zionism. So we have the early Jewish anti-Zionists were Reformed Jews in the United States, right? The Reform movement was initially anti-Zionist. Because the Reform movement believed that Jews were a religious group, not a national group, and therefore opposed Zionism on that basis. Ultra-Orthodox Jews, of course, opposed Zionism as a heretical movement. They saw it as trying to do God's work, in a sense, bringing Jews to the land of Israel before the coming of the Messiah was a heresy for many ultra-Orthodox Jews, and still is for some. Jewish liberals opposed Zionism because they saw it as a threat to their own integration into the societies in which they lived. It was saying, essentially, you are not Frenchmen or Englishmen or Americans. You are Jews, and that was perceived by many Jewish liberals as a threat. Jewish socialists and Jewish communists opposed Zionism. So there was many reasons for many Jews before Israel's establishment to oppose Zionism. Since Israel's establishment, Jewish anti-Zionism has declined, and for many, many years it was waning and waning, but as I said, it's re-emerged to some extent in recent years. It's finding a renaissance in the Jewish world. But I think it's safe to say that most Jewish anti-Zionists are not motivated by anti-Semitism. That's not to say that none aren't, right? There may well be Jews who have internalized anti-Semitic ideas, right? Internalized anti-Semitic beliefs, who may suffer from what is sometimes simply described as self-hatred. But I think most Jewish anti-Zionists do not have such a motivation, right? They're not moved by prejudice against Jews. Okay, that's an easy case. Let's take maybe a somewhat harder case, Palestinians. Is Palestinian anti-Zionism motivated by anti-Semitism? Is it prejudice against Jews that motivate Palestinians? Well, in some cases, I can think of most notably, historically, the leader of the Palestinian national movement before Israel's establishment in the 1930s was a man called Hajj Amin al-Husseini. You may have heard his name. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was the predominant leader of the Palestinian national movement before Israel's establishment. He was also a rabid anti-Semite. He went on during World War II to work with the Nazis. Right? So clearly, in the case of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, his anti-Zionism was tainted by anti-Semitism. Right? We can also think of Hamas, right? Hamas, if you look at Hamas's founding charter from 1988, it's dripping with anti-Semitism. It literally quotes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an anti-Semitic forgery. So I have no doubt to this day, Hamas leaders and Hamas militants harbor anti-Semitic beliefs and ideas. So certainly, we would say that simply being a Palestinian doesn't give you immunity, right, from anti-Semitism. But I also think it's wrong to equate all Palestinians or stigmatize all Palestinians as anti-Semitic because they oppose Zionism. We need to recognize that for most Palestinians, the reason why they oppose Zionism is not because it's a Jewish national movement. It's not because it's Jews, it's because of what Zionism has done to them. Whether we agree with it or not, their opposition to Zionism is at least understandable, right? It is because they have been historically displaced by Zionist settlement, dispossessed by it. And so for them, their opposition to Zionism is because of what Zionism has done to them and still does. So it would be wrong, I think, to equate all Palestinian anti-Zionists to describe or label them all as anti-Semitic. Let me take another case, which I think has been much discussed in the news in recent months, left-wing anti-Zionism. Not Palestinian, which I think is understandable, not Jewish anti-Zionism, but rather people who are neither Jewish nor Palestinian, but stridently opposed to Zionism. Are these left-wing anti-Zionists anti-Semitic? Now, in a book from 2012, the late scholar of anti-Semitism, Robert Wistrich, argued that left-wing anti-Zionism was driven by anti-Semitism. And I think he may well be right in some cases. There is a long tradition of anti-Semitism on the left, going back even before Karl Marx himself. But I think the reason why many on the left oppose Zionism is not out of anti-Semitism, but out of a view, misguided though I think it is, a view that essentially equates Zionism with colonialism, right? A view that really developed since the late 1960s, in the aftermath of the 1967 war, where on the new left, as opposed to the old left, which was broadly sympathetic to Israel, the new left increasingly identified and viewed Israel as a settler colonial state and embraced the Palestinian cause as an anti-colonial movement. So in this kind of left-wing worldview, which is still very much alive today, especially on college campuses, the Palestinians and groups like the PLO and Palestinian militants are perceived as kind of revolutionary freedom fighters, right? Israel is aligned with the Western imperialism and European colonialism, and so this worldview has become part of leftist or left-wing ideology, alongside anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Americanism, right? And so support for the Palestinian struggle on the left has become essentially a kind of marker of identity. If you're on the left, right, you support the Palestinian struggle, you oppose Zionism. And we've seen a lot of this in recent months. There's this commitment on many on the left to anti-colonialism and anti-racism now, and that leads them to support Palestinians and oppose Zionists, who they basically regard as pro-apartheid colonialists. That's pretty much the left-wing worldview. Now, it is a deeply problematic worldview. The reason, and I think we've seen over the last few months, the problems with this worldview, because essentially it's led some on the left, not all, but some on the left, to excuse, deny, even condone Hamas's atrocities on October the 7th. It is a worldview that is reductionist. It divides the world into essentially two camps, right? The progressive, the enlightened, the anti-colonialist, anti-racist, and anti-Zionist, okay? And the other side, okay? And in this very binary, very simplistic worldview, Israel is in the camp of the oppressor, right? Zionists are in the camp of the oppressor, and the oppressed can basically do anything, and that is somehow considered justified or acceptable. Clearly, that, I think, is an morally bankrupt perspective. But I don't think it's necessarily anti-Semitic. It has anti-Semitic outcomes, as I will talk about, because it condones violence against Jews. But it's not necessarily motivated by prejudice against Jews themselves. It's motivated by this ideology. Okay, let me now turn to the second factor then. Not attitudes, not what people think or feel, but rather behavior. Is anti-Zionism discriminatory, regardless of what motivates it? And I think this is a really important question, because too often in the debate about anti-Zionism, we focus on intentions. We focus on what somebody thinks or feels about Jews, and we have this, do they hate Jews or not? And actually, first of all, we can't really know what's in people's minds, so it's a kind of endless argument. But I think the harder question is not whether anti-Zionists are secretly hostile to Jews. The harder question is whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic in effect. In other words, it leads to anti-Semitic outcomes, regardless of how people feel towards Jews. Now, the claim here made by the conflators is that anti-Zionism is effectively discriminatory. Doesn't matter what your motives are, doesn't matter what your feelings, even if you're Jewish, right? It's discriminatory. Why? Because it denies Jews the same right to national self-determination that other nations are entitled to. This is the argument, that, by denying Jews the right to have their own independent state, that is automatically, necessarily discriminatory, because other nations have this right, so by denying it to Jews, you are effectively discriminating against Jews. Now, I think there's a number of problems with that. For one, the problem is that there is actually no universal right to national self-determination and statehood, but let's leave that aside. I think it is fair to say that if a person supports the right of all people, all nations, under any circumstance, to have a state of their own except Jews, that is discriminatory, right? That is discriminatory, clearly. If every other people, if every other group is entitled, whether it's the Palestinians, the Kurds, the Catalans, the Basques, you name it, every nation, and there are hundreds of nations, if somebody says, yes, all of these nations should have a state of their own, but not the Jews, for whatever reason, it's discriminatory. However, so in some cases it may well be discriminatory, but I think in many cases when we're talking about most anti-Zionists, they're not opposing a theoretical right to self-determination. They're not opposing the Jewish right to self-determination, rather they're opposing Zionism as they see it in practice, not the right, not Zionism as a right the Jews have to self-determination, but rather Zionism as it's historically been implemented and what it's historically meant for the Palestinian people. In other words, for most anti-Zionists, it's not an objection on principle, It's an objection to what they see as Israel's oppression of Palestinians, and it's a demand for equal rights. And this illustrates a fundamental disagreement between how we think about Zionism. For most Jews, Zionism is a principle. It is the right of the Jewish people to exercise self-determination in their ancestral homeland. But for most non-Jews, that's not what Zionism is. Zionism is what they watch on television, what they read in the newspaper. In other words, it's what Israel does, not what Israel stands for in abstract terms, but what they see as Israel doing. Now, we can disagree with that. We can say, well, Zionism is much more than just the behavior or the policies and practices of Israeli governments. But it's important to recognize that that's what they're objecting to, in many cases, when they're objecting to Zionism, not to a Jewish right. Okay, let me take another element of the claim that anti-Zionism is necessarily anti-Semitic. And this is the argument that it would necessarily result in great harm to Jews, that if implemented, in other words, if there was, say, a one-state solution to the conflict, it would essentially amount to a call for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Israel, or even worse, genocide against Jews. Now, I personally think a one-state solution is pie in the sky and is completely unrealistic. But I don't think that somebody advocating for this is necessarily advocating for ethnic cleansing or genocide. I disagree with them, but ultimately that is a disagreement rooted in our views about what is feasible, what is possible, what is potentially most workable way of resolving the conflict. As long as you support, as long as you accept that Jews in Israel, Jews living in Israel, have rights, have a right to be there, and I would argue have collective rights, not just individual rights, then it's not anti-Semitic. If you support a one-state solution, or any solution for that matter, and say, I couldn't care less about what happens to Israeli Jews, they should all go somewhere else to live, as we've heard some say, right, then that is anti-Semitic, okay? But there are those who believe in their heart of hearts that a one-state solution would be best. And I don't think I want to call all versions of a one-state solution necessarily anti-Semitic, even though, as I said, I think in practice, none of them are feasible. So what I've been arguing so far is that anti-Zionism is not inherently discriminatory or inevitably a call for ethnic cleansing or genocide. It's not inevitably or inherently anti-Semitic. However, there was going to be a however in this, right? And the however is that I think we have to recognize that while anti-Zionism is not always necessarily or automatically anti-Semitic, it does in practice often have anti-Semitic consequences, right? It often can lead to anti-Semitic outcomes. The most obvious historical example of this is the Soviet Union. Okay, one of the problems in debates about is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic is that these debates completely ignore history. They completely ignore the fact that anti-Zionism isn't just an idea that suddenly somebody's had on a college campus. Anti-Zionism is something that regimes have actually embraced in the past. So we can look at history. We can look and learn from that. And one thing we can look at is how it's been implemented and what it's actually meant in practice. And in the case of the Soviet Union, which formally embraced anti-Zionism in the early 1950s, it had clearly anti-Semitic consequences for Jews in the Soviet Union. Right? Now, it's true that Stalin initially supported Israel's establishment for reasons of realpolitik, and in fact, if it hadn't been for Stalin, Israel might not have come into being, because it was actually Soviet arms shipped through Czechoslovakia that allowed Israel to win the war of 1948. But shortly after, Stalin turned very, very strongly against the Jewish state and made anti-Zionism an official policy. For example, in 1952, he ordered the arrest and trial of many Jewish doctors who were branded Zionists and accused of planning to kill Soviet leaders as part of a secret plot by Western imperialists and Zionists. This was known as the Doctor's Plot. Right? This led to an anti-Semitic campaign in the Soviet Union, which kind of went on long after Stalin's death in 1953. And so Soviet Jews were basically seen as kind of crypto-Zionists, as traitors, as agents of Western imperialism, and subject to persecution and oppression on those grounds, because they were accused of Zionism. Not because of their Jewishness, ostensibly, but obviously there was anti-Semitism. And it wasn't just in the Soviet Union. In communist Poland as well, for example, there was a major purge of Jews from the upper echelons of the Polish government after the 1967 war, which led basically to the mass exodus of Jews from Poland. We can think about examples in the Arab world, most notably in Iraq, of course, where as anti-Zionism became official policy in Iraq, that led to the Farhud, that led to massacres and attacks of Jews in Iraq and in other Arab countries. So in these instances, historically, anti-Zionism has had anti-Semitic consequences, undoubtedly. What about today? I think today as well, contemporary anti-Zionism also often has anti-Semitic consequences. Doesn't mean to say it always does, but it often does, specifically against Jews outside of Israel. And as I mentioned at the opening of my remarks, we've seen, unfortunately, many examples over the last few months of where anti-Zionist protest or anti-Zionist action is targeting Jews. A Jewish deli, for example, graffitiing a Jewish deli or assaulting a Jew walking down the street and calling or shouting in his face, "Free Palestine," is anti-Semitism. Now, and the reason why Jews in the diaspora have often ended up as the victims of anti-Zionism is because most diaspora Jews have become Zionists. Right? And for that reason, the real-world consequences, the actual consequences of anti-Zionism can make it effectively anti-Semitic. Just to give you a few examples. If Zionists are denounced as racists, as they often are nowadays, and Jews identify as Zionists, then it can often lead to Jews being vilified and harassed as racists. Right? If Zionists are being excluded from a college club or from a political organization or from a political rally, right, then that can often lead to Jews being excluded from those organizations and rallies. Right? So in other words, even if people want to target Zionists, right, they're saying we're not opposed to Jews, some of our best friends are Jewish, right? But we're only talking, but because most Jews now identify as Zionists, they end up being the targets, right? And in some cases, singled out. Just to give you one example that you may have heard of, in October of 2021, the DC chapter of this environmentalist movement, the Sunrise Movement, was organizing a rally promoting voting rights and statehood for the District of Columbia, for DC. And the organizers and a local chapter of the movement asked the organizers of this rally to exclude 3 Jewish groups from participating on the grounds that they identified as Zionist. Right? Now, it is true that this group who asked this, the DC chapter who made this request, didn't object to the participation of other Jewish groups in the rally. They only objected to the participation of the Zionists, of the groups that identified as Zionists. However, what makes this anti-Semitic is they did not object to the participation of non-Jewish groups that support Israel, only Jewish groups. So in other words, this is a case of discrimination because Jews are being singled out, right? Rather than anybody who identifies, which you might say is still wrong, I would say it's still wrong, but not necessarily anti-Semitic, okay? And we're seeing these kinds of things taking place where Jewish students, for example, are having to undergo a kind of litmus test, right? Where they're having to disavow their support for Israel or their Zionism in order to become join a student government, for example, or they're simply asked about it. right, in running for student government, and non-Jewish students are not asked the same question. They're not expected to disavow their support for Israel. That's discriminatory. Doesn't matter what's motivating it, it's discriminatory because Jewish students specifically are being singled out. Okay, so in other words, when Jews and only Jews are being ostracized or excluded or interrogated because of their support for Israel, that is anti-Semitic. That doesn't mean to say that whenever we hear anti-Zionism, whenever we that it's necessarily anti-Semitic. That, for example, in recent months on college campuses, we've heard chants like "Free Palestine." These can be deeply offensive to many Jews, right? They can be upsetting. They can even be experienced very threatening. I understand why, right? But to be offended is not the same as, that doesn't amount to anti-Semitism. Discrimination amounts to anti-Semitism. Offense does not. So we need to be able to disentangle the things that we may dislike or find offensive from the things that are actually discriminatory. When a march is taking place and Jewish students are being harassed, that is discrimination, right? If their march is simply taking place, even if we don't like the slogans, but it's not leading to the harassment or attacks or threats against Jewish students, then it's not anti-Semitism. We need to be able to disentangle these things. And unfortunately, too often, we're kind of lumping it all together. Okay, let me turn to the final way in which anti-Zionism may or may not be anti-Semitic. And I said that's in terms of culture, in terms of how it's expressed. And the question here is anti-Zionism expressed in anti-Semitic ways? Does it employ anti-Semitic stereotypes, tropes, or images? And again, here the answer is sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, right? When it projects anti-Semitic stereotypes onto Israel, when it invokes anti-Semitic tropes like conspiracies, or uses anti-Semitic images like the swastika, okay, or draws on anti-Semitic myths like the blood libel, that is all anti-Semitic. And it's true that often is the case, not always, right? Again, in the Soviet Union, if you look at Soviet propaganda, that was distributed around the world from the 1960s and 1970s, that propaganda, that anti-Israel, anti-Zionist propaganda, often drew on anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes. It portrayed Zionism as this evil, shadowy global conspiracy, and Zionists were depicted in ways that drew on anti-Semitic stereotypes, caricatured with big noses, for example. Clearly, anti-Semitic ways of expressing anti-Zionism. In contemporary terms, we sometimes hear, particularly on the far left, claims about the Zionist lobby controlling Congress, or controlling the media, or now controlling a college, a university, for example. That is drawing, of course, on an anti-Semitic trope. The idea of Jews exercising, secretly pulling the strings of the powerful, of politicians, of the media from behind the strings, from behind the scene. So clearly that is anti-Semitic. When Israel is depicted as somehow uniquely evil, not just engaging in human rights violations, not just doing things that people disagree with that are wrong, but uniquely evil. When Israel is demonized, that is also anti-Semitic because that's how Jews have been depicted, as a source of unique evil in the world. Okay? When Israel is accused of deliberately seeking to kill Palestinian children, for example, right, having a bloodlust, that can echo the anti-Semitic blood libel. So there are certainly ways in which anti-Zionist speech, anti-Zionist discourse can invoke, and often does. Because these ideas are deeply rooted, it's quite easy for people to draw on anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes without even realizing it. So sometimes anti-Zionism is expressed in anti-Semitic ways. And when it is, we need to call it out, And we need to explain what's anti-Semitic about it. When somebody says, well, they're criticizing Israel or they're criticizing Zionism, that doesn't make it not anti-Semitic. It's how you criticize Israel. It's how you criticize Zionism. That's important. Okay, let me conclude then. What I've been trying to present here is hopefully a more nuanced approach to a very polarized issue. A very polarized discussion, so that we're better able to explain the ways in which anti-Zionism can be anti-Semitic, but also to recognize that it's not always anti-Semitic. Now, you might say, okay, well, you know, you're a professor and it's all very well what you've said, but it's totally academic and theoretical, and I'm sensitive to that particular criticism. But I do think, you know, so you might say, you know, what does it matter? Wouldn't it be better just to treat all anti-Zionists, all anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic, just to err on the safe side, right? You know, and just to like not make these subtle distinctions? Well, I think the reason I think that's not the case and why it's essential for us to distinguish between the two and be able to identify when anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic and when it isn't is because we need to be able to use the charge of anti-Semitism very carefully and deliberately, because we live at a time of rising anti-Semitism. We live at a time where anti-Semitism is entering our political mainstream and our cultural life. And if we call everything we dislike anti-Semitic, and if we label everyone we disagree with anti-Semitic, then we're in danger of people saying, well, anti-Semitism is meaningless. This is just a term of an attempt to silence or abuse, and it has no value. We need, in other words, to use this charge so Jewish claims of anti-Semitism can be taken seriously. Because if Jewish claims of anti-Semitism are not taken seriously, Jews are less safe. And we face real dangers today. And in order for those dangers to be recognized, we need Jewish claims of anti-Semitism, whether they're on campus or in the wider world, to be taken seriously. And that's why we need to make these claims thoughtfully and carefully. And in order to do that, we have to understand what anti-Semitism is ourselves and understand and explain to others who genuinely don't necessarily know when it becomes anti-Semitic and when it isn't. So, thank you. Now, I think I've given you, I hope, a lot of food for thought, and now you'll have an opportunity to discuss what I've said, and I hope you can think about examples, and I will go around as you're doing that. So.
Thank you very much. Could we have one more round of applause, please, for Professor Waxman? Thank you. So not only food for thought, but food for your tummies as well, coming up right away. My name is Lynn Davis. I'm director of the Jewish Community Relations Council for Tucson and Southern Arizona, and I'm thrilled to be here with you all tonight. A little run of show, a little bit. This is an opportunity to get up, stretch your legs. Please help yourself to a beverage. We, I believe, are putting desserts on the tables as people are up and about. And then, when you sit back down, we would like people to regroup a little bit and make sure that each table has at least 6 people, 6 to 8 people, so we don't have, you know, 1 or 2 sitting by themselves. And we have table captains, we have facilitators. Their name tags have a number on them. So at least 1 table captain per table, please. And then some agreements that we would ask everybody to adopt and embrace this evening. And those are, as you sit down for your conversations, please be respectful. Let everyone have a chance to be heard. If you've already voiced your thoughts or asked your question, please let others have an opportunity as well. We all often say 2 before you, right? So if you've had a chance to talk, let a couple other people have a turn. Commit to learning, not debating. And maybe a good question to think about as we sit down together is, what did you learn tonight? Is there something that may have changed your mind? Is there something that you're going to carry out if you're thinking about this, telling someone else tomorrow? Listen respectfully without interrupting. Listen actively with an ear to understanding other people's views. Please avoid inflammatory language and avoid assumptions about any individual or generalizations about groups. Don't ask individuals to speak for or defend their perceived social group. And remember that we can criticize ideas without attacking individuals. And I thought Dove said something very important during his lecture, which is there's a difference between feeling uncomfortable and being endangered. And I know that sometimes, with very fraught conversations, it's hard to discern between those two. But thank you all for being here. You're doing something very brave by sitting down with a table full of strangers and talking about difficult subjects. And we really, really, really appreciate that. And we wanted this to be a safe space to talk about whatever might be on your mind. So, beverages, desserts, and conversation. And then I believe, Lori, I believe that each table will have a scribe, and we will maybe advance one question per table as we wrap up that we'll bring back up to the front for Professor Waxman. So thank you all very much.
Without a doubt, one of the hardest things I ever have to do is stop amazing conversations. And what I can hear throughout this room is some amazing conversations. And if we could stay all night, then I would let us, but I think I better start this portion, which is where we're gonna hear from each different group, and maybe you can have a question, you can offer your comments from the group, whatever you feel the most comfortable with. And also Dove will join me, and he can answer questions if you have a direct question. But also, where normally I take the microphone away and say, if you don't have a question, give it back, we'll actually let you make comment tonight. So, Lynn, do you have a first comment from this table?
Yes.
Or questions?
Yes, but I've been silenced. No, yes, but I told Sharon she could only pick one, so here we go.
Because she had many.
Okay, I'm going to speak really fast, all three. No, I'm kidding. We had a great discussion. Really interesting question is how and or do the politics of Israel impact anti-Zionism today? So the politics starting before October 7th, but the current politics. And what do you think the impact of that has been on anti-Zionism?
Can I answer that?
I like how she started you with a simple
Yes,
question, Dove.
but that's a really, really good question because, first of all, it recognizes that anti-Zionism doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right? Anti-Zionism, the appeal of anti-Zionism, the popularity of it, is influenced by things that are happening in Israel and especially in Gaza now. And I think, so in terms of Israeli politics, I think the expressions of Zionism that people are hearing from people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and other, Jewish fascists, basically, I think that they are Jewish fascists, is sullying, is really tainting the image of Zionism in the eyes of the world. That increasingly it is the most extremist, messianic, racist people who are being represented now as the embodiment of Zionists. People say, "Oh, look, this person, this minister is calling for the peaceful resettlement or ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, and that is therefore Israel's policy." This is the danger. This is one of the reasons why I'm critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu for bringing into government these people, these Kahanists, who were previously considered beyond the pale, and they were not allowed into government, let alone into positions of real influence. And the fact that they are makes it harder to dismiss them. So I will say, look, don't pay any attention to Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir. They're not in the major positions of influence, but the fact is they do speak for a not insignificant number of Israeli Jews. They do represent a strain of Israeli politics, and I think that is really tainting the image of Zionism, particularly for younger people. for young students who don't have, when I was on college campus, Yitzhak Rabin was Prime Minister of Israel, and Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated when I was an undergraduate student. So when I thought of Zionism, I thought of somebody like Rabin. And that wasn't hard for me then to identify as a Zionist. When a young person today thinks of Zionism, who are they going to think of? Netanyahu, right? Or even Itamar Ben-Gvir or Smotrich or others. And no wonder they associate Zionism with these people. They don't know that, their memory is much shorter than ours. They don't think of these earlier figures. They don't know of the early historic, let alone, people like Herzl or Ha'at Ha'am. So that's why it's important to recognize that for many kind of young anti-Zionists, what they're opposing is the Zionism as represented by this current Israeli government. And, if there was a different government with a different leader, or not at least with these, real extremists in the government, then I think it would influence. So, yeah, I think the perception of Zionism isn't just set in stone. It is shaped by what Israel does and who represents Israel on the world stage.
That's a fabulous answer.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. We had a great discussions at this table and made a lot of new friends, I hope, hopefully. There was a theme here towards the end about the fact that high school students, college students, even graduate students do not know anything about history in general, and especially about history here. Is there any movement on campuses like UCLA to teach history to undergraduate students so you can have a conversation with them and not have to yell at them?
Yeah, I hear you. I feel the same. I wouldn't sort of say, I think most people don't know much about history. I find the historical, and I'm going to I am an American, but I'm originally from the UK, and I do think generally Americans don't learn a lot about history. Their knowledge of world history, they learn a bit about American history, but their knowledge of world history is, next to nothing. But certainly young people, even less. So, and it's very difficult because, unfortunately, students today more and more approach a college education like getting credentials for a job. And so there's a general disinclination to take humanities courses. And so history is suffering. I'm not a historian, I'm a political scientist. Actually, I have a lot of students in my classes, and I teach a course on Middle East history and politics. So there is an interest, but students feel the pressure to credential, to get jobs, to pay off student loans. And so and sometimes the parents are telling them to take these courses. I run an Israel Studies Center. I deeply believe that the best antidote to some of the very simplistic kind of sloganeering that we're hearing on campus and the very crude reductionist views of Israel that some young people have, often from social media, is for them to take a college course on Israel. That's why I run the center, and that's what we try and do. But I recognize, and through them, it's not just the students who take a course. My maybe naive vision is that student, will then talk to their friends and their family members. So education is the key. We need to be promoting more of these kinds of courses, but it's not just enough for college students. I think we need to do it more broadly in general, and recognize that very often what's behind these attitudes that we may disagree with isn't malice, but ignorance. And therefore we have to engage with people, not thinking of them as hostile, but rather thinking of them as people we can educate in a way that's not patronizing, and engage with them. But that takes time. But I think generally speaking, that's a far better approach than the kind of shaming somebody, or even worse, we've seen sometimes doxing people, because of their views, rather than saying, let's actually try to sit down and engage with somebody and recognize that, they might not know about Jewish history. They might not even know much about the history of Israel. And it takes time, though, and that's not very satisfying in this moment where we want immediate solutions. But that's ultimately the necessary, not just when it comes to learning about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but, learning about many, many global issues.
I think it's fitting. My comment and story is changed because I am a historian who taught high school history classes for about 25 years. So I have a lot to say about the young kids and what they know or don't know about history, and I agree with what's been said, but their parents didn't know any better, and in fact, often less than what the kids know. Or they know, quote unquote, but what they know is actually more problematic than if they didn't know.
Right.
So there's a whole story to tell about learning and relearning and unlearning, and that's for another day. But I certainly agree, education is key. What we talked about at this table, and I very much appreciated this conversation, is there's a visceral response and a physical fear to what's happening. We're all very nervous coming here tonight to what we would be even experiencing. Very pleasant with the result. We feel like we have more of a toolbox to go into these conversations with. So your 3 points, beliefs, behaviors, cultural norms, it's very helpful. The nuanced conversation is where I will bring my 2 comments together, because the nuance is the real key. When I'm talking to my high school age kids, they wouldn't listen to most of you because you're just old folks. You often don't listen to them because they're just dumb kids. Both are equally bad and equally limiting, and that's the nuance that we need to bring to all of these subjects. And so one of the things we were asking at the table at the end is, okay, now we have this new understanding and it's very helpful. What do we do with it? And, I'll just say it. I don't have an answer, but seeing as there's very few people under 30 in this room, and I am one of very few non-white people in this room, we need to bring this conversation to more people, and we need to bring this conversation to more groups. And they're not going to understand us unless we bring the conversation to them. And being angry, judgmental, and shaming is not going to give us the good look that we're trying to bring to them. So thank you very much, and I really liked this conversation.
Thank you. Well, I 100% agreed with everything you said.
One more question, last question? Okay, one more. Two more?
Two more.
Okay, two more.
So I don't know if this is a conversation, a question rather. There is a question embedded. First of all, at this table, there were lots of feelings being expressed, a lot of confusion about where the clergy, our clergy, are, and why positions aren't being taken. There were also those who felt it's better to give something time because there's so much we don't know. And I think that was a very positive thing. What was opened was old conversations and old ways of looking at things, and maybe not a lot of forward thinking in terms of a new tact, which is what you have suggested to us, a lot of discernment. One of the, I made a comment, which was that not all, that the situation in the Middle East is evolving, and there are groups like the Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia who have moved on. And this necessitates a different posture from the Palestinians. I wonder if you would want to speak to that. And I think the bottom line is patience is needed. And maybe the urgency to take a stand or put forth a resolution could be very reckless. So could you speak to the need for patience and newness of what's on the horizon that we're not all aware of?
Yes, so, I mean, first of all, we're in a crisis situation right now. I mean, Israel is in one of, if not the worst moment in its history right now, and it could get worse. I mean, I don't want to, I'm probably depressed you already, but it's this, you know, I don't want to understate the severity of the situation that we're in, that Israel is in, and I think also that American Jews are in as well, in terms of our relationship with Israel, and you know, the shifts that are taking place. So I would like to say, yes, we should, you know, take time and wait to see but we don't have that luxury. Certainly Israel doesn't have that luxury. You know, we've waited for a while to see how things might evolve, and we were told, you know, a few years ago, oh, Israel's going to be able to make its agreements with the Arab states like the UAE and Bahrain and maybe soon Saudi Arabia, and, you know, everything will kind of, you know, sort itself out. And even if Israel doesn't make peace with the Palestinians or, you know, withdraw from the West Bank or allow a Palestinian state, it will all, you know, just wait. Everything's, well, we've seen what that led. I think there is an urgency. There's an urgency in us in this moment doing what this gentleman over there said, which is to reach out, because while there is a very strong and understandable inclination or even temptation to withdraw, to feel that the whole world is against us, the whole world's against Israel, the whole world's against us, we are existentially alone, and therefore we need to kind of just pull up the drawbridge and withdraw. We don't have that luxury. In this country, we face a serious democratic crisis, serious threats to our democracy here, and a threat to democracy is a threat to Jews, because Jews don't fare well in authoritarian regimes. So we face major challenges right now in this coming year that we have to address, and we need to be doing that. And Israel faces massive challenges, which could well get worse if war breaks out between Israel and Hezbollah, full-scale war. So this is a five-alarm situation. And we, therefore, each one of us, I think, has some responsibility to recognize the severity of the moment, much as we can wish it were otherwise. Of course, I wish it were otherwise. I wish none of this were taking place. But we don't have that luxury, and so we need to, while doing as much learning as we can and having a humility of what we don't know and don't understand, at the same time, we all have to do whatever we can to try to build bridges and try to promote peace, or at least, you know, an end to violence, because the situation is, right now there is a raging fire, and that fire is already, you know, burning us here and around the world. So I wish we could just kind of have the luxury of time and let's see how things go. But I think that wouldn't meet the moment, the historical moment that we're in.
It seems to me there's a need for a third category up on that board. There's a category for Zionists who feel that Zionism is seriously broken and needs to be fixed. But we're still Zionists. We want Israel to exist, but we want it to be a just Israel, and it definitely isn't.
Yeah, and I think actually, you know, I would personally put myself in that group. I mean, I think Zionism, like any ideology, you know, there are multiple strands, and it's a living, breathing ideology that can continue to evolve. And I think, you know, it's incumbent upon all of us who care for Israel's future and to be engaged in that, to ensure that the likes of Itamar Ben-Gvir and others don't get to define what Zionism is. We don't allow them to speak for what Zionism is, and we say there is another path, there is another way. It doesn't have to be like this, and I think that's why, much as it's hard in this moment, it feels like between the kind of shrill and strident anti-Zionism, which just looks at Israel and all Zionists as racist, pro-apartheid colonialists, and the shrill Zionism that accuses anybody who has a criticism of Israel of being anti-Semitic, and there is no space for nuance. There is no middle ground. Most of us are in that space, are in that middle ground, and that's why we need to find our voices, and not allow the extremes to speak for us or to dominate the debate, and to remember, actually, although they may be the loudest, they are actually not in the majority. They are not actually, we just hear from them a lot. And if you're on social media, it seems like these extremes are the majority, but that's not the case. So you can, survey after survey shows, actually there is a much more moderate majority out there, but right now we're just kind of intimidated often. And I think we need to find our voice and speak up and say, this is not acceptable. But we're not going to just withdraw and step away. And my fear is that, more and more Jews may just decide, they don't want, especially younger people, will just walk away because this is just too hard. And it is hard. It is painful. It is difficult. But as I said, I feel like for the sake of Israelis and Palestinians, and ultimately for the sake of Jews, we can't walk away. If we care about that, we have to stay engaged, and we have to do, each one of us in our own way, our part in trying to bridge these differences. And I think hopefully by coming here this evening and engaging in these discussions, I'm realizing how many people, even if you don't all agree, that you can have these difficult conversations and hear each other and engage. That is possible. And that what you've done this evening is model that. And so I'm commend you all for doing that. I'm grateful to you.
What a fabulous question to end on, because, as you said, we have to find our voice. Please join me one more time in thanking Dr. Waxman for his time tonight.
Hello, my name is Martin Reichgott. I'm the Director of Philanthropy at the Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center. For many of you, this is the first time that we're meeting, and if we haven't met personally, please, I'd like to have a conversation with you. I want to make sure that we thank all the generosity that goes into the Lakin Lecture series. The Tucson Jewish Community Center for hosting us in such a gracious fashion. Our community partners, the Weintraub Israel Center, Jewish Philanthropies of Southern Arizona, and the incredible generosity of Stanley and Norma Feldman, Michael and Marcia Zakaria, and of course the Ed and Alma Lakin Education Fund. A big round of applause. And honestly, the opportunity to continue these courageous conversations is what we do every day. Our mission is education. Our mission is collaboration. And we do it with these lectures, with our band book club, with reaching out to other marginalized groups and having important, courageous conversations on how we can create a safer community. And we have a free museum. We have education in which we pay for buses to bring the next generation to the museum and learn. And I'm up here saying, if you value this, if you believe this is part of the solution, we truly, truly appreciate your investment. And if you're here today, if you're online, you believe in what we're doing, and you believe in a stronger community. So once again, thank you all. Thank you for our generous partners, and we appreciate your investment.